In the vast expanse of the galaxy, where civilizations span across countless worlds and species, power was often determined by age-old traditions and political alliances. The Galactic Council, made up of the most influential species, had ruled for centuries, keeping balance among trillions of sentient beings. But the Council, full of arrogance and certainty, had no idea how much their complacency would be shaken by one human. James Calloway was not an important figure in their eyes. A former soldier from Earth, he had found a new role as a diplomat for his people. Earth itself was still a young, relatively small player in the galactic scene, far from the ancient empires of the galaxy. James's job was simple: to represent Earth's interests and navigate the complex web of galactic politics. He wasn't seen as a threat, just a useful tool in the hands of the Council. That was until the king of Aldoria died. The Aldorian kingdom was one of the most respected and powerful in the galaxy, a massive empire stretching across several systems. The Aldorians had an ancient bloodline and traditions that could not be easily changed. The king, a feared and powerful ruler, had left behind a legacy that many would envy. But what the Council hadn't anticipated was that the king's death would cause such a stir. The king's only heir was his daughter, Princess Seraphine. But there was a problem. Seraphine had been raised in a turbulent environment, always in her father's shadow. She had spent her life defying him, rebelling against the royal traditions, and challenging her place in the kingdom. Her relationship with the late king had been strained, to say the least. She had no desire to take the throne, and no one expected her to be the leader the Aldorian people needed. So when the king passed away, the Galactic Council saw an opportunity. They had already decided that Seraphine wasn't fit to rule, and they were determined to find a way to keep Aldoria under their control. They needed someone to guide Seraphine, someone who could help her step into her father's role and keep the kingdom from falling into chaos. That's when they made their decision. In an unexpected twist, the Galactic Council handed over control of the kingdom, not to an Aldorian noble or another powerful species, but to a human, James Calloway. The decision was made swiftly and without consultation. James, as Earth's diplomat, was chosen to inherit Seraphine and guide her to the throne. The Council believed it would be a simple task. After all, James was just a human, a species with no great political or military power in the galaxy. How could a single human possibly manage a kingdom as vast and influential as Aldoria? And as for Seraphine, the Galactic Council assumed she would be easy to control. They didn't think she had the strength or the will to resist, especially not with a human overseeing her future. To them, it was a laughable situation. A human, a species that was still considered young in galactic terms, inheriting the responsibility of an entire kingdom. It was absurd. They couldn't help but laugh at the idea. However, they hadn't considered one crucial factor. James Calloway wasn't an ordinary human. He had seen things, fought battles, and made decisions that had shaped the course of human history. He wasn't interested in the political games of the galactic elite, but he wasn't afraid of them either. James had a different kind of strength, a quiet, determined strength that would soon surprise the entire galaxy. As James received the message from the Galactic Council, he couldn't believe it at first. He had been chosen to guide a rebellious princess, to rule over a kingdom with centuries of tradition, and to navigate the complex politics of the galaxy's elite. It was an overwhelming task, and he knew the pressure would be immense. But James wasn't one to back down from a challenge. On the other hand, Seraphine was furious. She couldn't believe the audacity of the Galactic Council. She had been raised to be strong, independent, and defiant. The last thing she wanted was to be controlled by a human, especially someone she didn't know. She had spent her entire life fighting against the expectations of her father, and now she was expected to submit to a human diplomat. The two of them were a mismatch, and the galaxy's elite knew it. The laughter echoed throughout the halls of the council as they thought about how easily this human would fail. They believed Seraphine would reject him, and the entire situation would collapse in on itself. But James had a plan. He was no stranger to impossible situations. He had dealt with political conflicts and delicate negotiations before, and now he was determined to prove that humans were not as insignificant as the galaxy believed. As the news spread across the galaxy, one thing became clear. No one, not even the mighty Galactic Council, could predict what would happen next. The game had changed, and James Calloway was ready to play. Princess Seraphine stood on the balcony of the royal palace, staring out at the sprawling city below. The people of Aldoria were celebrating the death of her father, the king. For years, she had lived in his shadow, trapped in a gilded cage of royal expectations. Now, with his death, the kingdom was left in chaos, and the Galactic Council had decided that a human, James Calloway, would take control of the kingdom's future. Seraphine's anger burned like a fire inside her. How dare they? How dare the Galactic Council think that a human could lead her people? She had spent her entire life fighting against the system her father had built, and now, instead of taking the throne herself, she was being forced to answer to a human, a species that barely mattered in the galaxy's grand scheme. How dare they? Seraphine muttered to herself, her eyes narrowing. They think I'm weak. They think I'm just some rebellious child who needs to be controlled. A servant entered the room, interrupting her thoughts. "Your Highness," she said timidly, "James Calloway is here to speak with you." Seraphine turned sharply, her eyes flashing with frustration. "Let him in," she snapped. The servant hesitated for a moment, then nodded and left the room. Minutes later, James walked in. He was tall and strong, with a calm but determined expression on his face. His uniform, a simple suit of dark blue and gold, marked him as the Earth diplomat, but there was no mistaking the power that radiated from him. He had a quiet confidence about him that made Seraphine uneasy. "Your Highness," James greeted her with a small bow, his voice steady. "I know this is difficult, but we need to work together for the good of your kingdom." Seraphine scoffed, crossing her arms. "Work together," she repeated, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "I don't need you. I never asked for your help, and I certainly don't want it." James didn't flinch. He had expected this. Seraphine was angry, and with good reason. She had been thrown into a situation she didn't want, and now a human was standing before her, telling her what to do. But James knew that if he was to have any chance of earning her trust, he had to approach this carefully. "I'm not here to take your power, Seraphine," James said quietly, his eyes locking onto hers. "I'm here to help you take control of your own future. I know you're angry, but the kingdom is falling apart. People are already questioning your ability to rule. If we don't act quickly, things will only get worse." Seraphine's eyes flashed with fury. "I don't need you to tell me what I should do," she shouted. "I can handle this myself. I don't need some human telling me how to rule." James remained calm. "I'm not telling you how to rule. I'm asking you to work with me. As a partner. You don't have to trust me right now, but I'll earn that trust. We can find a way to unite the kingdom, Seraphine. But we have to start somewhere." Seraphine turned away, her back to him. She was silent for a long moment, her fists clenched at her sides. Her whole life had been a struggle against her father's oppressive rule, and now she was being asked to work with someone who was essentially a stranger, someone who she believed knew nothing about the complexities of Aldoria or the galaxy. "Why should I trust you?" she finally asked, her voice softer but still filled with skepticism. "You're just a human. You don't know what it's like to live under my father's rule. You don't know what it's like to be trapped in a place where your every move is controlled." James paused, his expression thoughtful. He had read about Aldoria, studied the kingdom's history, and learned about Seraphine's own struggles. But he knew that he could never fully understand what it had been like for her. "You're right," he said, his voice genuine. "I don't know what it's like to live your life, but I know what it's like to fight for what's right. I know what it's like to stand up when everything seems impossible. And if you're willing to try, I'll help you fight for Aldoria's future." Together, we can make sure that your kingdom isn't just a legacy of your father's oppression. We can create something new, something better." Seraphine was quiet for a moment, processing his words. She had expected him to be like the others who had come before him, arrogant, self-important, and only interested in their own gain. But James was different. His calm, steady presence made her question her assumptions. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't like the others. "I don't trust you," Seraphine said firmly, her back still to him. "But I'll give you a chance. Don't waste it." James nodded, a small but determined smile crossing his face. "I won't," he said. As he left the room, Seraphine stood there, her mind racing. She had agreed to work with him, but she still didn't know if it was the right choice. One thing was certain, though: this human was unlike anyone she had ever met, and the galaxy might be in for a surprise. James Calloway stood at the head of the Grand Council table, the weight of the Aldorian court pressing down on him. The room was filled with nobles and influential figures from across the galaxy, all eyes fixed on the human who had somehow become a key player in their long-established power game. Seraphine, still reluctant to trust him, sat beside him, her posture stiff and guarded. She hadn't spoken much since their last conversation, but her eyes often darted to James, watching him closely, as though trying to figure out what kind of man he really was. The council members murmured among themselves, whispering in Aldorian and other galactic languages. They were all wondering the same thing. Could a human really navigate the treacherous political waters of Aldoria? Or would he fail, as they all secretly hoped? The court's nobles, seeing Seraphine as weak and inexperienced, had no faith that a human outsider could bring any kind of order to the chaos. But James wasn't bothered by their doubts. He had faced challenges before, ones far more dangerous than a room full of skeptical nobles, and he knew exactly how to turn this situation to his advantage. "You all know why we're here," James began, his voice steady and commanding. He looked at each person around the table, making sure to catch their eyes. "The kingdom is fractured. There are too many factions trying to seize control, but none of them have what it takes to bring peace to Aldoria. The only way forward is unity. And if that means breaking with old traditions, then so be it." Seraphine's eyes widened, but she said nothing. This was the first time she had heard James speak so boldly in public, and something about the way he commanded attention caught her off guard. She hadn't expected him to be so direct, so confident. A lord from one of the powerful noble houses, Lord Zarek, sneered. "You speak of unity, human, but you do not understand Aldoria. We have centuries of tradition, and you think you can change it with a few words." James didn't flinch. "I understand more than you think," he replied, his tone calm but firm. "I understand that your traditions have kept Aldoria divided. I understand that you've used your power to control the people, to oppress the weaker factions. But it's time for something different." Seraphine watched, surprised. She had expected James to crumble under the pressure of the council. Instead, he stood his ground, challenging them, speaking in a way no one else dared. His confidence was contagious, and a small part of her began to wonder if he might actually be the right person for this job. The room fell silent as James continued, outlining a plan to bring the kingdom together. He proposed a series of reforms that would empower local leaders, giving them more autonomy, while still keeping Aldoria united under one banner. His plan was bold, even revolutionary, but it was grounded in practicality. He didn't just talk about ideals. He gave concrete steps to solve the kingdom's problems. Lord Zarek, still clearly frustrated, raised a hand. "And what of the military? What of the power we hold to keep the peace?" James met his gaze evenly. "The military should protect the people, not the nobility. If you truly care about Aldoria's future, you'll support these reforms. The military's role will be to maintain peace, not serve as a tool for the rich and powerful to maintain their grip on the kingdom." The tension in the room was palpable. The nobles shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to react. The idea of losing their influence over the military was not something they were willing to accept easily. But James wasn't finished. Aldoria cannot continue to live in the past. Change is coming, whether you like it or not. And if you do not accept it, the kingdom will fall into chaos. For the first time, Seraphine spoke up. Her voice was strong, though not without hesitation. James is right. We can't keep hiding behind old ways. If we want Aldoria to survive, we need to adapt. We need to build a future where all our people, not just the nobles, have a voice. James looked at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. He could see that Seraphine was beginning to understand. She had always been a fighter, someone who resisted authority, but now she was starting to see the potential for a new kind of leadership, one where she could lead, not by tradition, but by creating something truly her own. Lord Zarek scowled but said nothing. The other nobles were still unsure, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The council was divided, but James knew he had made progress. He had proven that a human, someone with no ties to Aldoria's royal bloodline, could come into their midst and challenge the old way of doing things. As the meeting continued, James felt the first glimmer of hope. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. The council's laughter was no longer as loud as it had been. Instead, there was a quiet uncertainty in the air. Maybe, just maybe, the human could do what they thought was impossible. And as Seraphine looked at him, she realized something she hadn't considered before. James Calloway wasn't just a diplomat. He was a leader. And perhaps together, they could bring Aldoria into a new age. The human, who had been laughed at, was slowly proving his worth, and Seraphine was beginning to believe that he might just be the partner she had needed all along. The days following the council meeting were tense. James Calloway had made some progress, but not nearly enough to turn the tide in his favor. Seraphine had agreed to work with him, barely, but she was still a reluctant partner. She couldn't forget that she had been forced into this position, and now she had to trust a human to help guide her kingdom to safety. It felt impossible. James, however, was patient. He knew that trust wasn't something that could be earned in a day. He had seen how skeptical Seraphine was, but he also recognized the fire within her, the desire for freedom, for something different than what her father had created. If he could just reach her, if he could show her that they could do something together, maybe the kingdom could survive. He spent the next few days meeting with Seraphine in private, going over his plans and showing her the details of his reforms. They talked long into the night, discussing the challenges Aldoria faced and how best to solve them. Though their relationship was still strained, James could see that Seraphine was beginning to think differently. She asked tough questions, pushing him to think deeper, to refine his ideas, and he did. He knew that the road ahead was uncertain, but together they could make it work. But not everyone shared James's optimism. One morning, a messenger arrived at the palace with urgent news. A major faction of the Aldorian military, led by General Kale, had declared their opposition to the reforms. They believed that James's plan to limit the military's control over the kingdom was a direct threat to their power. General Kale was an ambitious man, and he was not going to let some human diplomat change the balance of power without a fight. Seraphine stood by the window, staring out at the military ships in the distance. She could see the soldiers marching in the streets, their presence a reminder of the tension that had been growing within the kingdom. The military had always been a tool of the nobility, used to maintain control. But now, with James's reforms, they were losing their grip. "I should have known it wouldn't be this easy," Seraphine muttered to herself. James entered the room, his expression serious. "What's going on?" Seraphine turned to face him, her eyes filled with frustration. "General Kale has made his move. He's rallying the military, telling them that your reforms will destroy everything Aldoria has built. He's a dangerous man, James. He's not going to back down." James paused, thinking for a moment. "This is what I've been preparing for. We can't let fear stop us. The reforms are the only way forward. If we allow Kale and his supporters to push us back, the kingdom will never change. It will only spiral further into chaos. Seraphine nodded, but there was doubt in her eyes. And what if they fight back? What if we lose everything? We won't, James said firmly. We have allies. There are people within the military who support the reforms. We can turn this around, but we have to act quickly. If Kale gains too much power, we'll lose any chance of bringing Aldoria into a new era. The weight of the situation settled on both of them. They were now in the middle of a power struggle that could decide the future of the kingdom. Seraphine was terrified, but she could see the resolve in James's eyes. He wasn't giving up, and neither should she. They quickly called a meeting with their supporters. Inside the palace's war room, they gathered the nobles, officers, and advisors who still believed in their vision for a better Aldoria. It wasn't a large group, but they were loyal, and James knew they were the key to gaining the support they needed. Seraphine addressed the room, her voice shaking but determined. General Kale is not the future of this kingdom. His greed and ambition will destroy everything. We can't let that happen. If we want Aldoria to survive, we need to stand together. We need to fight for the reforms that James has proposed. They are the only chance we have. There was a murmur of agreement from the group, but not everyone was convinced. Some of the older nobles still clung to the old ways, unwilling to let go of their power. They feared change, and they feared losing everything they had built. James stepped forward, his voice steady. Aldoria's future isn't about holding on to the past. It's about moving forward together. The military can either fight for the people or for itself. We need to show them that the future of the kingdom isn't something we're willing to sacrifice. The room fell silent. The tension was thick. Everyone knew what was at stake. This wasn't just a political fight. It was a battle for the soul of Aldoria. After a long pause, Seraphine spoke again. I know it's hard. I know we've spent our lives looking over our shoulders, afraid of what might happen next. But we have to believe in something better. I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing this for Aldoria. And I need your support. One by one, the room nodded. They didn't all agree with the changes, but they understood the stakes. General Kale was a threat, and if they didn't act now, they might never have another chance. James could see the shift in the room. The group was coming together, just as he had hoped. Seraphine had found her voice, and she was starting to lead, not as the princess with a crown, but as a leader who truly cared for her people. Let's do this, James said quietly. Together. And with that, they prepared for the showdown. The battle for Aldoria's future was about to begin, and neither James nor Seraphine would back down. They had no choice but to fight, for each other, and for the kingdom they both wanted to see rise from the ashes of the old world. The sun had barely risen over Aldoria, but the tension in the capital was palpable. Soldiers filled the streets, marching in perfect formation. The military's power was growing by the minute as General Kale continued to rally his forces. His influence stretched far and wide, and many of Aldoria's elite had already pledged their support to him. The kingdom stood on the brink of a civil war. James Calloway, however, wasn't afraid. He had come too far to back down now. Beside him, Seraphine stood tall, her expression resolute. The palace had become their last stronghold, but they had supporters in the city, in the military, and within the people. The coming battle would determine whether they could build the future they dreamed of, or if the kingdom would fall back into the hands of the military elite. In the war room, James and Seraphine stood over a large map of the city. Around them, their allies whispered in hushed voices, discussing tactics and possible strategies. The group was small, far smaller than Cal's forces, but they were united in their cause. They had the truth on their side, and James knew that the people of Aldoria, those who had been oppressed for so long, would join them when the time came. We don't have the luxury of time, Seraphine said, her voice cold but steady. If we wait too long, Cal's forces will surround us. James nodded, his mind racing. We need to hit them fast, disrupt their plans, and give the people a reason to rise up. If they see us fighting back, they'll see that there's hope. Seraphine clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She had never imagined that it would come to this, that she would have to fight for her throne. But she was done being a puppet, done being the helpless princess caught in a game of power between her father's old allies. She was ready to take her kingdom back, no matter the cost. "We strike tonight," James declared, looking around at the group of supporters gathered in the room. "We'll move in small units to sabotage Cal's supply lines and disrupt his communication. We need to make sure he doesn't have a chance to organize fully." There were murmurs of agreement, and though some of the nobles looked uneasy, none spoke against him. It was clear now that there was no turning back. As the night approached, the city grew quiet. A nervous energy filled the air as James and Seraphine prepared for what could be the most important battle of their lives. Outside the palace, small groups of soldiers and loyal civilians quietly gathered in secret. They were determined, ready to face whatever came next. When the moon finally rose, casting a pale light over the city, the first wave of attacks began. Small, agile teams, led by trusted officers, moved swiftly through the shadows. They struck at key points, sabotaging the military's supply warehouses, destroying their weapons caches, and cutting off their communications. The Aldorian military, so confident and organized only hours ago, suddenly found itself disoriented and vulnerable. James and Seraphine moved with their forces, leading the charge in the heart of the city. It wasn't a large army, but it was a motivated one. And that made all the difference. The people of Aldoria, seeing their chance, began to join in. The streets, once quiet with fear, were now alive with the sound of revolution. Cal's forces were caught off guard. They had underestimated James's ability to organize and the fierce resolve of Seraphine. As the hours passed, their soldiers began to retreat, confused and uncertain. The tide was turning. But General Cal was no fool. He had anticipated resistance, and he wasn't going to let a few attacks ruin his plans. His own forces began to regroup, and they launched a counterattack, hoping to push back the rebels and restore control over the city. Seraphine's heart raced as she watched the first of Cal's reinforcements approach. This was it. There would be no second chances. "We need to hold them off," James said, his voice urgent but calm. "If we can stop Cal's counterattack, we'll have the upper hand." Seraphine's jaw clenched. "Then we fight. We fight for Aldoria." She led her small team to the front lines, rallying her people with every step. It wasn't just a fight for power anymore. It was a fight for the soul of the kingdom. The military had always ruled with fear and oppression, but now Seraphine and James were giving the people a chance to rise above it. The clash between Cal's forces and the rebels was brutal. Blaster fire filled the air, and the sound of clashing weapons echoed through the streets. But Seraphine fought with a fierceness she hadn't known she had. She moved with precision, cutting through enemy lines, her every move a message to the kingdom. This was her fight, and she would not back down. James fought by her side, directing their forces with a calm and strategic mind. His experience as a soldier in the Earth Forces gave him an edge. He knew how to read the battlefield, how to stay one step ahead of the enemy. Together, they made an unstoppable team. As the night wore on, Cal's forces began to falter. They were disorganized, their morale shattered by the unexpected resistance. Slowly, the tide of battle began to turn in favor of the rebels. When dawn finally broke, the first light of day illuminated the streets of Aldoria. The battle had been fierce, but the rebels had won. Cal's forces were retreating, and the city was under the control of those who believed in the future Seraphine and James had fought for. Seraphine stood on the steps of the palace, breathing heavily but with a sense of pride that filled her chest. She had led her people to victory, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she truly belonged in her kingdom. James stood beside her, his gaze unwavering. "We did it," he said, a quiet pride in his voice. Seraphine nodded. We did. But this is just the beginning. The fight for Aldoria's future wasn't over, but for the first time, Seraphine could see a new dawn breaking on the horizon. Together, she and James had taken the first step toward a brighter, freer future for their people. The dust had barely settled from the battle, but the streets of Aldoria were already filling with people. They came from every corner of the kingdom. Farmers, merchants, nobles, soldiers, all rallying around the new hope that had begun to take root in the city. The rebellion, led by Seraphine and James, had taken the capital. General Cal's forces were retreating, and the once impossible dream of reforming Aldoria was now a reality. But even with the city under their control, the war was far from over. The true challenge was yet to come. Seraphine stood before the massive throne room, the cold stone walls around her filled with echoes of the past. The throne itself loomed in the center of the room, the very symbol of her father's rule, of the power that had kept Aldoria in chains for so long. Now it was hers to reclaim. James was by her side, his calm presence a reminder of the journey they had been through together. His confidence, his unwavering support, had kept her grounded when everything seemed uncertain. She had seen him rise to the challenge in ways she hadn't expected, ways that made her trust him more than she thought possible. King Eldrin looked at her, his eyes searching for any trace of doubt, but Seraphine was resolute. She had made her decision, and nothing would change it. Without another word, King Eldrin turned and left the room, his footsteps heavy as he retreated into the shadows of his former life. Seraphine stood tall, the weight of the crown no longer a burden, but a promise. She had taken the kingdom back, and now she would lead it into a new future, one that was hers to shape. James stood beside her, his support unwavering. Together they had won, and together they would rebuild Aldoria. The fight was far from over, but Seraphine knew that with James by her side, they would face whatever came next. The kingdom was hers now, and she would make it thrive. The days after King Eldrin's retreat were filled with uncertainty, but also hope. Seraphine had assumed control of the throne, but it wasn't an easy transition. She had spent her life in the shadow of her father's rule, and now the weight of the crown was hers to bear. The palace, once a symbol of her family's power, felt different to her now. It was no longer just a place of luxury and comfort. It was the heart of a kingdom in need of healing. Seraphine stood at the balcony of the palace, looking out over the city. The streets, once quiet and fearful, were now full of life and energy. People had gathered in the central square, singing, laughing, and celebrating their newfound freedom. The news of her victory had spread quickly, and the people of Aldoria were finally able to breathe easy. For the first time in a long while, they believed in a future that could be different. James joined her, standing by her side. "It's hard to believe, isn't it?" he said, his voice full of wonder. "This city, this kingdom, has changed in ways I never thought possible." Seraphine smiled faintly, but there was still a touch of sadness in her eyes. "It has, but there's still so much work to do. The old ways can't be forgotten overnight. I need to rebuild trust, mend the wounds my father left behind." James nodded, understanding. "You don't have to do it alone. We'll do it together." Her gaze turned back to the city, to the people who had stood by her side through it all. "Yes, we will." The path ahead was uncertain, but Seraphine knew she wasn't facing it alone. James had proven time and again that he was a true ally. He had not only helped lead the rebellion, but had stood by her through every challenge, every difficult decision. His loyalty wasn't just to her, it was to the people of Aldoria, to the future they all deserved. In the weeks that followed, Seraphine worked tirelessly to reshape the kingdom. She held meetings with the remaining nobles, some of whom were reluctant to accept the new order, while others had already pledged their loyalty. The military had been reorganized, and Cal's loyalists had either been dismissed or brought into line. Slowly, the changes Seraphine had envisioned began to take shape. James, always by her side, became an important advisor, helping her navigate the complexities of rebuilding the kingdom. He had a sharp mind, and his experience in Earth's military helped him understand the balance of power. Together, they made a great team, one that was determined to guide Aldoria into a new era. One evening, as the sun set over the horizon, casting a warm glow over the palace, Seraphine sat in her chambers, reviewing documents. James entered, holding a letter in his hand. "From the council," he said, handing her the letter. Seraphine opened it, her eyes scanning the words quickly. It was an official invitation to the Galactic Council, a formal request for her to attend the next summit and represent Aldoria. The council had heard of her victory, and they were eager to see how she would lead. "They want me to represent Aldoria," Seraphine murmured, her mind racing. This could change everything. James leaned against the doorframe, watching her carefully. "You've earned this. The world is watching, Seraphine, and they're ready to see the kind of leader you've become." Seraphine stared at the letter for a moment before folding it carefully and placing it on the desk. "I didn't want to be a leader at first," she admitted softly. "But now I realize it's not just about ruling a kingdom. It's about giving people a voice, a chance to make their lives better. Aldoria can't stand still. We need to grow, to join the greater world." James smiled, proud of her growth. "And you will. I believe in you." That night, as Seraphine lay in her bed, she thought about all the people who had helped her get to this point, her allies, her friends, and even the people who had once feared her. She thought about her father, and how much he had shaped the kingdom, but also how much he had failed it. Now it was her turn to shape the future. In the coming days, Seraphine prepared for her journey to the Galactic Council. It would be a great test, one that would challenge her leadership in ways she had never imagined. But she was ready. She had already fought the hardest battles, against her father, against General Kale, and even against herself. Now, the world awaited her. As she boarded the ship that would take her to the council's headquarters, James stood beside her, a steady presence as they faced the unknown. He had been with her through every step of this journey, and now he would stand by her as she faced the next chapter. The stars stretched out before them, a vast and endless expanse. Aldoria was just one small world in the grand scheme of things, but it was her world. And Seraphine was determined to make it one that would thrive. With James by her side and the future in her hands, she knew there was nothing they couldn't achieve together. A new dawn had arrived for Aldoria, and Seraphine was ready to lead it into the stars.